Welcome to the Ecology, Cosmos and Consciousness Salon. Rather ephemeral, slightly irregular, supposedly once a month kind of talk, although we do have some kind of rather random insertions when we have great guests coming from over the pond, such as Erik. And for those of you who don't know, you probably do all know Erik Davis, so I imagine that's why you're here. Author, not least of which, was it your first book, Exegesis, which I absolutely loved, and numerous other books about Led Zeppelin and nomad modes, and also doing a PhD now in religious studies at Rice University, and he's here to talk to you tonight about Philip K. Dick. So please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
All right, thanks David, and thanks for inviting me here. Since I've been given a talk here at the October Gallery before, and I really enjoy the space and the vibe. And I think what I'm going to do, I'm actually just about to embark on the arduous and grueling process of writing my PhD, which is going to be about, surprise, surprise, Philip K. Dick and his religious experience. And so what I thought I'd do, since I've been thinking a lot about it, is really just kind of riff through a lot of the things that I've been thinking about, a lot of approaches I'm going to take, and I'll preface it with some personal stories, because I think that there's, certainly in my experience, there's often an interesting kind of personal resonance with the science fiction author and his books, and a certain kind of compulsive relationship to the text and the man himself that can happen, which was very much my experience. I first heard about Philip K. Dick in the summer of 1985, when I was living at a very peculiar place called Barrington Hall. And Barrington Hall was a student-run co-op on Berkeley campus, and of course Dick lived in Berkeley and other places in the area, as did Robert Anton Wilson. And Robert Anton Wilson was one of the themes of that very, very peculiar summer. Its details I will not bother you with right now. Barrington Hall was a very peculiar place because it was sort of a holdover of the counterculture. One might even say the dregs of the counterculture. There were clearly many speed dealers, addicts, heroin dealers, addicts. The walls were covered with peculiar graffiti. The carpet smelled of cat piss. There were a lot of very heavy characters there. A lot of people into, occultism and freaky politics, and it was a very strange, very Berkeley kind of environment. And one of these characters, who was an intellectual fellow, turned me on to Phil Dick, and it was a very interesting time because at that point he was quite obscure. He had died 3 years previously, and while he was gaining some fame and some strength in his financial career towards the end of his life, he was still a pretty obscure guy. Science fiction writers, science fiction, but even a lot of science fiction writers or readers wouldn't have been interested in his sort of freaky, vaguely countercultural kind of peculiar tales. So at that point, it really was kind of a cult to be a Philip K. Dick fan, and I, dove shortly, a year or two afterwards, sort of dove into that cult and collected everything I could and read everything I could, and became as interested in the biography as I was in the books themselves, something else that often happens with Phil Dick. There's a peculiar presence to his own personality, his own concerns, that radiates through the books, even though the books are set in bizarre science fiction scenarios and feature, usually networks of a variety of individuals, not usually centered on one singular individual. Nonetheless, there's a sense in which the books themselves are intimately related with Phil Dick's very personal obsessions, and along with that, of course, as part of the cult, you become kind of interested in the facts of his life, the very peculiar, fascinating, disturbing, sometimes depressing dimensions of his own psychological life, wrestling with psychological problems, with his multiple marriages, his periods of intense drug use, particularly amphetamine, his sort of kind of passages through depression, his agoraphobia. He's clearly somebody who wrestled regularly with pathological conditions and problems, and yet coupled with this was also what one can only really call a visionary temperament, someone who had the capacity to dream deeply and to occasionally experience really extraordinary states of consciousness. The first sort of major one, I mean, there's some dreams and experiences that he talked about from his childhood frequently, and returned to frequently in his own letters and conversations with people. But really the first sort of major vision, which may, as in everything in Fielding's story, be something of a fabrication. It took place in 1963 when he saw this metal face leaning out of the sky in the clouds over Point Reyes in Marin County, where he was living in the sort of brief kind of country phase of his peripatetic existence. And this figure, this impression, this visionary encounter really fed into, to my mind, one of his most remarkable novels, the one that I usually recommend when people say, what one should I read? Depending on the person, that's always kind of a funny question. Hey, I haven't read one, which one should I read? It's usually like, there's a few different genres of people, and I'll be like, okay, you should read ballads. You should read The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which is the book that I'm talking about. But it's really the experiences that Dick has in 1973, 74, kind of carries into 75. It sort of, it flows and bends again depending on how you read it. But really it's the early 1974 experiences that really, make his biography particularly remarkable. And I'll talk a little bit more about those experiences in a moment. So this sort of obsession with his own life, as well as his bizarre and marvelous fiction, was really part of the kind of cult I felt that I was inducted with in some way. And it was really a marvelous time. And then also to watch his fame grow. And I wrote some articles in the early 1990s, so I sort of even helped participate in making him into this kind of almost patron saint of visionary science fiction futurism, and participated in a process whereby he became kind of canonized the way he is now. So when his books were issued in America by the Library of America, which is a sort of upper middle brow collection, gathering together of all the great American writers and essayists, when they had some of their most successful books were these editions of Philip K. Dick novels, and in a way that just kind of indicated that he had fully arrived, that he was not only one of, if not the most important American science fiction writer, that he was really one of the most important post-war writers in the United States, which I think is a fair claim to make, that he ranks with, whatever, Barth or Phil Roth or other Pynchon, people in that kind of zone. One of the reasons, interesting to ask about, like, why did that process happen? Why did he go from this obscure cult status into a strong sort of profile? And I think one of the reasons is that there is a kind of weird prophetic quality to his fictions. There's something in them that resonates, even though they were written largely in the 60s and 70s, quite some time ago at this point, that they're saturated with certain counterculture concerns, and also saturated with concerns from the 1950s, which was a really long time ago. I mean, he really was a man of the 1950s who then went through the counterculture rather than someone who was shaped from the get-go by bohemian values. And yet, despite the fact that this stuff is a little bit antiquated, there's something really powerful that resonates with us today. I don't want to talk too much about his fiction, because that's not really my concern in my work, and I also think that there's plenty of discourse around his books, and none of the discourse is half as interesting as just reading them, which I'm sure everyone here has done to varying degrees. But there's a sense in which that he prophesies not so much the actual technological character of our existence, the internet, or biotechnology, or all of the various ways that technology is transforming our experience of the world and transforming the world. Less that than he's somehow prophetically anticipating what it feels like to go through this process, this vague sense of uncanniness, of a kind of paranoia tinged with possibility, a sort of sense of capitalism in overdrive, seeping into the imagination, and yet at the same time the resilient possibilities of the human spirit, both our capacity to appreciate and connect emotionally with other people, but also the inherent capacities of consciousness to crack through the delusive construct of ordinary reality and possibly to peer more deeply into the structure of the cosmos itself. So all of these things, I think, resonate very strongly with a certain certain set of concerns, a set of people, and even sort of across the culture at large. I mean, one of the main vectors of his posthumous canonization really was, of course, the success of the films. You know, Blade Runner is based on Phil Dick's novel, and there's been a number of films, many of which are kind of mediocre, but some of which have done very well in the box office. And while, you know, arguably the great Philip K. Dick film has not yet been made, and I would like to take that point, if only to call out the possibility that the great Philip K. Dick film will be made. There's things that have come close, or aspects of films that have really done well. There's something about his stories that appeal to a kind of Hollywood setup, a sort of, you know, whodunit quality that probes the nature of existence, the constructed nature of reality that really appeals on a kind of mass level. And I think it's one aspect of his sort of prophetic characteristic occurs in the novel Valis, which of course is the novel that he wrote based on these peculiar set of experiences that occurred, or began to occur in 1974. And for those of you who haven't read the novel, which I strongly encourage you to, I think it's one of the great works of the second half of the 20th century, at least in my reading experience, that the first half of the novel is a more or less biographical account of his own experiences and his relationships with friends, with lovers, with people who are dying, that reflect his own kinds of experiences at this point living in Southern California. I mean, he does take his own personhood and split it into two characters, the crazy guy, horse lover fad, and the reasonable science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. So he's playing with his own identity and in very, very interesting ways. And the second half of the novel is much more recognizably a kind of fantasy, a kind of science fictional tale where this tribe of friends encounters this mysterious group that seem to be possibly tied in with alien intelligence, and there's a little girl who may be the savior of the planet. And, you know, it's much more a kind of science fictional story. And it's interesting to think about it, this hybrid book, this sort of partly autobiographical, partly a kind of intellectual discourse that relates to his exegesis, which I'll talk about more in a moment, and then also a more recognizable kind of fantasy, science fictional structure. And the hinge that moves from the autobiographical part, the real part, to this fantasy part is a film. It's a film, so it's interesting to think about in terms of Phil Dick's own work. What happens in the story is that some of his friends go see a film called Valis, and they become obsessed with this film. They see it multiple times. And the story in the film is more or less based on another novel that Philip K. Dick wrote that was sort of a predecessor to this book Valis, called Radio Free Albemarle, which has a sort of more recognizable kind of paranoid religious tale of you know, as usual, there's sort of kind of evil archon political figures who are kind of controlling things in an attempt to sort of, you know, break through this reality through a kind of counter-conspiracy. But so they go and they see this film and they become obsessed with it, and they begin to analyze the sort of marginal figures in the film. They start to pick out little clues and little hints that seem to point to a deeper meaning, and particularly a certain kind of figure that's drawn on a picture a little figure of a fish that we'll come back to in a second. And it's precisely through this process of reading, or one might say overreading, of kind of paranoically building up the hidden clues and marginal hints in this piece of cultural trash, this kind of junky movie that they're seeing. It's precisely by weaving these things together that they exit the sort of autobiographical part of the novel and enter into the fantasy and enter into the science fiction. So in some sense, I like to think about this curious film in this novel, a film based on another novel, as being a sort of prophecy of sorts for Phil Dick's own career. There's a line in the book, I'm going to mangle it to some degree, about how the makers of the movie, who are indeed this kind of salvational alien conspiracy, that they sort of had to make the film for the popcorn crowd, because it's only by making this sort of junky piece of popular culture that you can kind of get the messages out. And in a way, that's a way to look at it. That's Phil Dick reflecting on the prophetic capacity of his own work to instill, motivate, inspire some deeper reflection, things that go beyond just entertainment, that go beyond junk culture, that go into, at the very least, political thinking, but even more thinking about the structure of reality and the religious and philosophical questions that it can raise, that even in junky Hollywood movies, there's the possibility of weaving together the few clues, a few scenes, a few gestures in the margins of the frame, and out of that developing a much deeper and more engaged sense with metaphysical possibility. There's a great line from Dallas where he talks about the symbols of the divine initially appear on the trash, at the trash stratum. And something about that redemptive possibility of trash is in a way Dick reflecting on his own life of writing these pulp science fictions, most of which paid very little, a lot of which were written very hastily and published in a somewhat cruel market, often to a great deal of not caring on the part of readers, with some really important exceptions. It wasn't like he was completely marginalized. So there's this kind of redemptive, prophetic potential of popular culture that you see in his work that I think also had a great deal to do with the way in which that work itself became picked up and became more popular and became the fodder for Hollywood film. So it's a sort of interesting, very interesting arc there. But of course, to talk about him in terms of these prophetic ideas, to talk about the metaphysical and philosophical dimensions of his work, there's no way to extricate this from this peculiar experience that he referred to as 2374 for the second and third month of 1974, which became this kind of name for these sets of peculiar experiences, extraordinary experiences, some devastating and some marvelous, that happened to him. So one of the things that interests me about him as a figure, and I think that drives some of at least the recent kind of obsession with him, even in the mainstream media, is that he becomes someone who is important enough, whose fiction isn't recognized enough, who we have to take seriously enough, and yet who dived into the deep end of the pool of weird, whose experiences cannot easily be captured in any particular framework, whether it's psychopathology or religious experience, and indeed it's clearly something in between or beyond those two categories. So in a way, to take Phil Dick seriously as a literary figure, and I'm thinking here, as you can probably tell, partly as a person making a last-ditch attempt to get paid to teach people things by getting a PhD, and so I recognize the sort of somewhat both the attraction and the constraints of kind of academic discourse and talking about things in ways that pretty skeptical secular people can adopt. I'm not talking about Phil Dick in terms of the full weird potential of it, but really trying to kind of bring it into dialogue with more conventional ways of thinking, that if we take him seriously as an author, we have to take seriously and look very clearly and very carefully at this set of experiences and how they influenced him, and particularly how they influenced his later work. So let's talk about these experiences a little bit. it's interesting reading the letters that he doesn't really mention the sort of canonical story of his first kind of awakening to Valis, or what he'll call Valis at various points, until many months after the process itself. Kind of an interesting question. But this core story, which is told in most popular accounts, and it's a story that he himself told again and again with some significant variations throughout his life, involved him having a toothache. He had his wisdom teeth out supposedly, although he has questions about some of this. And everything, I must say, before I start saying it, has to be put in brackets, or has to be put in quotation marks. Why? One, because his narrations of these stories themselves changed. Two, because he was, without a doubt, a total bullshitter. He loved to fabricate stories. He loved to screw around with people and their expectations. And that's the intentional side of it. And then the unintentional side of it is that it's clear the more and more time you spend with his accounts and with his attempt to wrest meaning from these experiences, that he's in some ways playing games with himself, that he's setting up certain situations to allow himself in order to do certain things in terms of his writing, in terms of his thinking. And so there's a kind of a game going on whose author is not entirely clear. But it's good to think about it in those terms. So it requires us to not say, this is what happened, but to say, this is the story. And I'll talk more about that distinction. So the story, again, he's got this toothache. Delivery woman comes to the door. She's a dark-haired girl, which is sort of his archetype, his female, archetype for his personal taste. He looks at her. His wife Tessa claims that it may have simply been that she had a attractive chest. That he looks down at her chest and sees this fish necklace and says, "Oh, what is that sign?" And she says, "Oh, it's a sign that the early Christians used to recognize one another." And he sort of, at this moment, receives or is triggered through a set of experiences that sort of start happening that night and continue quite intensively over the next few days, and then off and on in ways that are hard to track with a calendar, because there are different accounts and different ways that he talks about it, but off and on for quite some time, and that leave traces, and it's complicated to kind of go into all the detail there. But there were a number of different kinds of experiences that followed this event, though I'm going to return to this sort of primary scene in a moment, but I think it's important to bring up some of the other experiences that he had. One of these, one of the more sort of lasting ones, was the sense that there was another personality within him who was sort of operating his own body and moving through his life to varying degrees at varying points for quite some time. Generally, he first identified this other being with Bishop James Pike, who was a renegade Episcopalian bishop who he befriended in the late 1960s, a fascinating character, another deeply Californian tale. Very briefly, he's the bishop of the Diocese of California. He's got a lot of power. He's radical, very liberal, questions the virgin birth, questions some of the fundamental doctrines of the church, gets hassled for heresy, eventually leaves the church and dies. Oh, then his son commits suicide. He does seances to connect with his son. He invites Phil Dick to some of these seances, or to at least one of these seances, where he tries to communicate with the spirit of his son. And then he goes to the Judean desert in order to hunt down clues of the sort of original Christian cult, which he suspected might have something to do with mushrooms. It might have something to do with the Essenes. It's not exactly clear what Pike's specific beliefs were, but in any case, he didn't prepare for the trip very well and ran out of gas, didn't have any water. I think they had one bottle of Coca-Cola, and his wife made it out, and he didn't. So that's Pike. So then, at first, Phil Dick thinks that the spirit of James Pike has come back to him, But gradually this kind of changes. There's a number of different possibilities he's thinking through. That's one of the features of his experience, is that he never really resolves any particular identification. He's constantly questioning, constantly asking himself, is this the, could it be this, could it be that, could it be this, could it be that, could it be the Soviets, beaming things into my brain, could it be God, could it be, my own, the vitamin C that I took that day. I mean, he's constantly asking himself what these things are. So any claims you make, in any way that I articulate what conclusion he came to is always provisional. But eventually he sort of identified this secondary personality most consistently with a 2nd century Christian named Thomas. And Thomas was sort of living, as a persecuted Christian. And this notion of the persecuted Christian church is fundamental to Phil Dick's imagination. Another expression of this connection with early Christianity is his visual experience of the surface of his neighborhood of Orange County, in the mid-1970s, disappearing, and what appears in its place is a vision of alternately, depending on where you read it, ancient Rome or ancient Palestine. But the basic idea is that there's a kind of a disappearance of nearly 2,000 years of history, which leads to some of his ideation that involves the idea that all of the time in between these periods is an illusion, and we're still actually in the Perugia, or in the expectation of the second coming of Christ from the perspective of the early church. So that's another, a significant strain of his alternative experiences. He also had another a night where he was shown in some kind of glorious hypnagogic vision a whole series of abstract images that he recognized or saw as kind of modern art, which is a very interesting way of describing the kind of visual phenomenology that can be associated with hypnagogia. And he variously thought this may have been beamed to me by Soviet scientists, or it was a display sort of given to him by the higher agency that he sometimes identified as Valis. This was one of the experiences that he kept coming back to. And then the most sort of explicitly paranormal one, in the sense that there's an actual claim on the immediate nature of reality that's made in this story, is the idea that listening to a Beatles song and receiving a beam of pink light, which he received at a number of different times, he was given the information that his son Christopher had this potentially fatal hernia, or something involving it. I can't remember what the detail is. Yeah, that's right. And so then they take him to the hospital, and it turns out that it's true. And so if they hadn't taken him in, he might have died. This story itself is questioned by people who are close to him. So again, like all of these stories, we must sort of put brackets or quotation marks around them. And there are a variety of other things that happen with Dick, which maybe we'll talk about later. So how to think about this, how to think about these experiences, how to think about a writer who has this extraordinary experience and then uses that experience in his further writing. The most obvious thing is the novel Valis, which we've already talked about. All of his late fiction in various ways deals with the consequences of this experience. And most of the novels deal with it quite intensively. But in addition to the fictions that he wrote, partly inspired by this, he wrote a true monstrosity of a text, a text that we refer to as if it were a single document, as the Exegesis, which is a name that he gave it, quite some time into the process of writing it. So what is the Exegesis? The Exegesis is about between 8,000 and 9,000 pages of mostly handwritten journals that he left when he died, the first few collections, volumes of it, because what the physical condition that it was left in was a series of folders. And the folders are numbered, though not in a chronological sequence. How exactly the folders were put together and who did them, there's some question. Dick did a lot of it, Paul Williams did some of it. It's unclear even how these things were put together, but they're not in order. Though you can build up a chronology from the few sort of internal signs that they have. First few volumes are put together from letters that he wrote in 1974 and 1975. So as he was writing letters, going through explaining his experiences to people, trying to communicate to people, he collected the carbons, and those formed the first folders. But most of it is this extensive, handwritten, late-night grind that he submitted himself to night after night, in which he relentlessly, restlessly, endlessly chews through the possibilities of his experience. This is a very, very peculiar text, and I can say this because I worked with the team that created an abridged edition of the Exegesis that was published not too long ago, and it's a real monstrosity of a text, and I'll just talk a little bit about it because it's a very interesting thing, because here we have this great writer who, yes, trafficked in trash and was not always the finest stylist, but is an important writer who, in addition to having very powerful, peculiar experiences which ride the margins between religion and psychosis and the paranormal, but he produced an enormous text. Now, if you came across this text and didn't know who wrote it, it wouldn't take you very long to put it in a certain category. Crank literature. We're sitting there in the Berkeley apartment of the main editor of the Exegesis, Pam Jackson, going through this, and she said, what's funny is that, like, right here in Berkeley, there's probably 30 exegeses hidden in basements within a square mile radius. Berkeley is the home for this sort of, conceptual, system-building, quasi-mad, quasi-psychedelic sort of excess, this kind of crank literature that we're very familiar with. The obsessive system-building, the obsessive return to the kind of axioms of the system. I mean, there are enormous chunks of this thing that are almost impossible to read because they're so claustrophobically paranoid. They're just these endless, bad science fiction plots of Russian spies and this endless obsession with a particular event that happened called the Xerox missive, when he received this document and he believed that there were coded clues on it, so he couldn't read it, and he had his wife read it, and by not reading the text, he sort of avoided a whole set of issues. I mean, real kooky stuff, like things that there's no way to say this was not deeply involved with psychopathology. So you have this, and he's doing this kind of thing even as he's writing a masterwork like Valis. And then there are parts of the Exegesis that are quite brilliant and quite beautiful and quite incisive and philosophically interesting and funny and wise and esoteric and quite interestingly esoteric. Like if you're familiar with esoteric literature, the range of references, the webs he weaves, the systems he creates are quite fascinating. So it's a very bizarre thing to kind of try to get your hand around, because there's no way to not kind of go in and try to cherry pick the bits that sort of make sense or that seem to work or that seem to have literary or philosophic value, and yet you can't really deny that you're plucking them from this immensely pathological kind of crank text. So this is a very interesting, very interesting problem. So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about how we think about the experience itself, how we start to approach the enigma of his own experience, how we think about it, and then talk about what's in some ways more tangible, but no less peculiar and stimulating, which is how this experience relates to writing, to the writing that we can read, to the writing that he did, to his ways of reading and understanding text and textuality, because I think it's in that zone that we can sneak up on the enigma of the experience perhaps a little bit better than simply asking ourselves what happened to him. Because the question with what happened to him in some sense leaves us in, you know, an endless regress. And the way that I've come to try to think about it is to, rather than leap into this question of what happened to him with the desire to find an explanation, is to use that desire to reflect on the way in which we deploy explanations when we sneak up on the anomalous. I would describe this approach kind of as 40 in a way, in the sense that you recognize that there are extraordinary experiences that seem to defy conventional reality, that there are patterns to these experiences which you can see reflected across human culture, but certainly in modern culture, in the deep repetitive patterns that seem to suggest much more than mere idiosyncrasy. And at the same time, there's something fundamentally elusive about the claims of these experiences, in the sense that trying to nail them down, particularly when they're occurring outside of any kind of laboratory setting, but even in those settings, there seems to be almost something in the phenomena themselves that elude and play with our very attempts to create traps to capture them in our explanations. And that there's always something fundamentally missing about a simple secular reduction. Nonetheless, I think it's important to sort of start off, you know, and just to say that before I mention that, and clearly we're dealing here with somebody who was suffering from a wide variety of psychological challenges and stresses, and had spent, you know, again, I already mentioned that, you know, from the age, you know, from a very, very young age, arguably from the get-go, he had very serious issues, which perhaps had a neurological basis, but at the very least had a profound psychological, persistent sort of blockage in his own attempts to relate to the world and relate to other people. So it's like we're already dealing with somebody who one is tempted to pathologize. And if you read through the literature, this is one of the interesting moves people make, is they start to go, oh, well, clearly he's bipolar, clearly he's a drug addict, or clearly there's this kind of diagnostic urge that comes up when people discuss this, because there's something enigmatic and crazy about his experiences and their claims, so they want to put it into a box. But in a way, he's already ahead of the game, because his own fiction is often obsessed with psychological typology, with the variety, the sort of the bestiary of psychological conditions that psychiatrists and psychologists have churned out over the last decades, always changing them, modifying them. Okay, there's Asperger's here and autism. No, there's an autistic spectrum here, and you know, there's a constant feedback between our own experiences as people with psychologies and this psychological master discourse that puts things into categories. And he's ahead of the game, because he's already, the problem with him is not the inability to diagnose him. It's that A, he's already diagnosing himself, and B, multiple diagnoses work. You can just keep adding them on. Yeah, that could work, that could work, that could work. So it's sort of, you can't fit him in the box. It's already spilling over the lip of any sort of category that you would try to put him in. That said, I think most people who look at this, even with a very open mind, can't get away from the high likelihood that what we're dealing with here is some manner of stroke or some manner of seizure. He died from hypertension. He had hypertension throughout his life. He had, you know, abused speed a great deal in earlier parts of his life, though not when he was experiencing these things in 2 through 74, when he was, you know, basically clean. He'd drink and smoke pot and probably, you know, occasionally do a bit more, judging from some of the signs in the exegesis, but he's basically over his speed stage. Nonetheless, we're dealing with a stressed system, and there is the sort of most conventional reductive explanation for what happened to him is the temporal lobe epilepsy, although there's different kinds of ways of talking about brain seizures that may be more fine-tuned than TLE. It's still a good place to start, because there's many factors of his own experience that seem to be reflected in people who have these they're not global seizures like in a classic epileptic seizure, but they're localized in the temporal lobes. As you might guess from the name, one of the things that's associated with this is a sort of breakdown of time, or some kind of profound undermining of the temporal flow, which you can see in his sort of superposition experience when Rome appears, and indeed his obsession throughout the exegesis with what he called orthogonal time, which was a kind of way of thinking about a sort of Platonic realm outside of time that nonetheless interacts with time, and that somehow his visionary experiences gave him a kind of portal into this ur-time, which had something to do with the Christian event in some frameworks, as if we were kind of in a kind of eternal return. So those are events. But the other really striking one that is really important to mention is hypergraphia, which is this absolute compulsion to write, which is found again with a lot of people who have this kind of epilepsy. And so this like incredible desire to crank out pages and pages of text endlessly and obsessively, going over the same kind of material. So in some ways, he fits this kind of diagnostic very well. And to deny, I think, that given these kinds of patterns, and even given questions we might have about how diagnoses work, and who gets to say what a seizure is. I mean, the more you think about seizures, they're pretty interesting. It's like, okay, yeah, we all know what like a grand mal seizure looks like. You can put them in an EEG, and you can see that there's something profoundly electrically bizarre is happening to the brain, and there's immediate effects. But the more localized you get around what a seizure is, it becomes a little unclear exactly at what point things stop being seizures and become sort of normal resonating brain functions, because part of the way the brain operates is by resonating different parts of the brain. I mean, there's an electromagnetic play that's going along all the time, and some of these things are intensifications that they have, sort of feedback loops associated with them. It may be that when we have deja vus, there's some little seizure happening somewhere in our temporal lobes. Is that pathological? Is that part of the way the brain works? Is it actually tuning the brain to recognize a different dimension of things that have nothing to do with pathology? It's a little unclear. But even if you raise up all these questions, I think it's very difficult not to say that something happened to him neurologically. But does that end the story? I don't think it does. And one of the ways I'm trying to think my way through this, and my thoughts might be sort of a little bit tentative here, because I'm trying to work my way through this, is to make a shift in the way we think about these experiences. And one of the things to do is to question the term experience. So I'm going to do that here for a little bit, both the term experience and specifically the question of religious or spiritual experience. The term experience is a really tough one, because on the one hand, it seems absolutely vital in our attempts to sort of underscore and affirm this fundamental aspect of our own engagement with the world in real time, our own enlivened sense of flux and presence, and to give that some central role in our account of reality. Say, yes, whatever else you're talking about, there is something like experience, and we need to engage and affirm the experiential dimension of things. Good. That said, of course, the term has its own history, its own ways of being used, particularly when it's bound up with this question of religious or spiritual experience. Why is this the case? Because, in a simple answer, that as Christianity became more and more challenged by new scientific accounts of reality, and already very strongly in the 19th century, when the whole fables and the mythology became more and more evident when it became clear that the earth was not 6,000 years old, etc., as the sort of worldview of Christianity was challenged, there became this increasingly desperate sense of where do we locate religion? You know, if it's not in the claims about the history of the world, if it's not even necessarily in the institutional forms, which are going through constant turbulence, especially following the Reformation, then where do we locate this? Where do we locate the sort of essence of religion? And one answer was in experience. That in experience, in religious experience in particular, there was kind of a sort of safe place where whatever the claims that might be made from skeptics are, there's a sort of something that knows itself already as religious experience, as an experience of the divine, of the sacred, of the numinous. And so this kind of discourse around the sacred and the numinous and religious experience grew up in many ways as a kind of a reactionary move vis-a-vis skeptical scientific accounts. And this influences the way we think about religion. This influences the way we think about religion, particularly in sort of alternative, spiritual but not religious or New Age senses. That the role of religious experience is absolutely central to these currents that try to keep alive the possibilities of the numinous and the possibilities of having a more than quotidian relationship to the world. Experience lies right in the core of it. And yet, there's a way in which that congealment raises all sorts of problems. Who gets to say what a religious experience is? Who gets to say what a spiritual experience is? In some sense, as soon as you ascribe an experience to religion, to spirituality, then you kind of bracket it off from all of these other possible ranges. And so in some sense, it's actually a malformation of even the most extraordinary experiences. I don't think it's accidental that in Phil Dick's case, he didn't really, though his first accounts of it, he did talk about having a religious, encounter, that his general term for it, for what happened to him, was a very abstract thing, 2374, a date, calendrical date. Why? Because in some ways I think it's better to think about what happened to him not as an experience, because of course an experience is something that we have. We have experiences. I have experiences. There's a relationship between experience and the self that's very fundamental to the way we use that term. I think a better way of thinking about these things, at least in this particular case, is to replace the idea of experience with event. There's an event. Something happens. But the ontology of that is unclear. So it happens to me. I've had an experience, an event has occurred. But in some ways, I'm not really sure of the status of this event. And one of the ways that I think this is a good term is because unlike experience, which you can say, I have an experience of the divine, and then the skeptic sits there and goes, yeah, no, actually, your brain is just resonating in an unfortunate and deleterious manner. And you're like, oh, okay, so what do I do with my experience? But event crosses both registers, because the basic idea is that even if there is a physiological dimension, even if there is a psychopathological dimension to these events, that does not in any way, in any logical sense, undermine their potential sublimity, their potential relationship to the numinous. In fact, one of the people that I work with getting my PhD, Jeff Kripal, makes a really strong, in a way, very obvious point, but if you really think about the consequences of it, it's quite significant, which is that many mystical experiences, religious events, whatever you want to talk about, paranormal events, happen around pathological situations, car wrecks, the death of people, extreme psychological distress, drug use, intense hunger, intense thirst, physical pain, that it's almost that pathology is part of the dynamic that sets in motion something that is much more than a mere reductive neurological passage of electrons. So in a way, what's interesting about Dick's experiences is that even the very nature of the most sort of skeptical and reductive explanation of the event does not forestall in any way the kind of multiple dimensions of it. The way in which the brain itself is involved potentially with ways of looking at the world, ways of experiencing the world, ways of perceiving the world, or at least perceiving the way the brain itself functions, that has these numinous, sacred, metaphysical, and philosophical dimensions. So for me, that's the way that I've kind of come to think about how to, in a way, keep the skeptical, reductive explanations at bay while also acknowledging the role of physiology and the role of neurology in these kinds of things, because again, it's thinking about all these things. But that's really the really interesting process in a way. Some scholars of religious experience now, recognizing the problems with saying things are religious experience, one of the problems is that means the religious people get to talk about what it means, and the anthropologists or the psychologists can't, or if they do, they have to fight about it, that it probably makes more sense to use a different kind of phrase. And there's a wonderful scholar of religion named Ann Taves, and what she does is she goes, look, let's leave aside religious experience. Let's just talk about, she calls them special experiences. I prefer extraordinary. And what's really interesting is that it's what happens after these things. How do they become constructed? How does one come to ascribe these things to various registers? If I have an extraordinary, illumination of the deep interconnectedness of the world, okay, cool. Maybe I can sort of vaguely language that in the rear view mirror. But then what do I do with that? Do I say that was a religious experience that maybe I can use as a foundation stone to build a cosmology? Okay. Do I look at that neurologically as, a kind of, maybe it was a local seizure that gave me a little weird drug trip that was kind of cool, like that acid trip I had when I was 14? Do I think, well, no, what's actually happening is that like my brain is reshaping itself in order to perceive a kind of dimension of reality that's usually not available, but I'm not thinking of it in supernatural terms or religious terms in any way, but trying to think about it through quantum physics or whatever. So it's that process whereby we ascribe meaning, or we ascribe definition to these experiences, where in some ways the action lies, because there's something about the experience itself that's always kind of elusive. And what's wonderful about Philip K. Dick is, we have this extraordinary amount of text from someone who was deeply concerned with his own psychological processes, but was also incredibly imaginative, philosophically, linguistically. So we have this marvelous text that is responding to this event. That's one thing. Then the other thing he does, which is so characteristic of his personality, the characteristics of his novels, characteristic of some of his ultimate philosophical questions, is that he never makes up his mind. The usual tendency for people who have extraordinary experiences, really extraordinary experiences, is they either kind of like push him away, like, oh, that was a trippy thing, I don't know, I don't really want to talk about it, I'm not sure, or it becomes a foundation stone of a new reality. No, I've seen that the world is run by a network of aliens, that they're actually created this virtual reality in order to harvest our souls and feed off of our negative emotional energy. That's my, no, that's the one, that's the answer. And what Phil Dick does, because he's a science fiction writer, because he's obsessed with building systems and building cosmologies, because he loves the creativity of that process, is that he constantly undermines the stories that he tells, the ways in which he tries to figure this event. And so there's this wonderful kind of iterative quality to the exegesis that on the surface levels can be quite tedious, but really what he's doing is this sort of he's sort of showing the way in which these description processes happen, showing the way in which we build metaphysics, we build meaning from these fundamental kinds of enigmas that we encounter. To give this a little bit more flesh, I want to return to the kind of primal scene of 2374, the encounter the delivery woman in this fish necklace. I already mentioned in the film Valis how one of the ways they put together the sort of secret conspiracy of salvational, alien energies that were coming into the earth is by following this curious little symbol that reappears in different forms throughout the film. So there's something about this notion of a symbol as a trigger that's really, really key to Dick's formulation of his experience. So we have to ask ourselves, what can we say about this fish symbol? Let's look at the symbol. Let's look at the trigger. Let's see what the sign tells us. Well, one thing it tells us is the particular historical time and place where this event occurs. The fish was not a conventional symbol for modern Christianity in America until the very end of the 1960s, when Jesus freaks, countercultural people who for various reasons return to not to the church, but return to Jesus Christ, return to the Bible, sometimes still doing LSD, usually turning away from drugs. It was that movement that claimed the fish as a symbol for Christianity. So you don't see a fish in 1950s American Christianity anywhere. You see it especially emerging in California in the late 60s and early 1970s. So the Christianity that is, or the Christian symbol that is spurring Dick's sort of enlightenment experience, or his certainly his sense that there's something profound in the Christian story, has to do with this very specific kind of time and place. But there's more curiosities to the symbol. One of the interesting things about the exegesis is that it's filled with doodles. Some of those doodles are reproduced in the abridged edition of the book, but there are many, many more. And a recurrent set of symbols are his various permutations, doodles one might say, of the Christian fish sign. So the two swooping lines become an eye, then they become a mouth with teeth, they become a DNA double helix, etc., etc., etc. And these seem to express what he describes in a few places in the exegesis as a kind of three-dimensional transformation of this image that he perceived in his own eyes. So at one point he's looking at a bumper sticker that he put on his wall of the Christian fish, and it's sort of, the letters in it start to permutate and become more signifiers of this sort of ancient world, in particular of this sort of utopian vision of the palm tree garden. But it's as if that visual symbol, and it's sort of retained on his inner eye, begins to go through permutations. But those permutations, as they go through, seem to suggest different dimensions of the mystery. They refer to DNA, to life itself. They refer to the eye, to the third eye, to the sort of, ajna eye vision. They refer to the fish symbol, to this recurrent return to the Christian event. So there's something really kind of potent, even in the way that this, not quite a word and not quite a symbol, sort of shifts and moves. And he's really interested in it as a trigger, and that's one of the main ways he interprets it, is that there was something preloaded in him that was triggered by this sort of informational exchange, because there's some kind of semiotic, there's some kind of data implied in this symbol. Reading closely in his letters and in the later exegesis, he makes a small number of nonetheless very significant references to a particular text in relationship to this experience. And this is the place where where we have to acknowledge that his relationship to 2374 and the meaning that he made out of it was not just about his own writing, but it was also about his reading, because he was already a voracious reader. But what this really set him off on is an immense, in some ways superficial, in some ways phenomenal consumption of philosophical, esoteric, mythological, and religious material from around the world. he became sort of a global seeker in his own bedroom with his encyclopedia set, because much of his ideas and notions came from the 15th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. So he was very interested in one of the important things to do that I'm doing in my work, I think, is to show how his reading helped to make meaning from this event. But this particular story is worth accounting for a number of reasons. One of which is simply that I think it's one of the greatest Gnostic fables that we possess, and indeed one of the greatest pieces of literature from antiquity. And it's a short piece called the Song of the Pearl, or the Hymn of the Pearl. And it's found in a 3rd century sort of apocryphal text called the Acts of Thomas. Acts of Thomas. And Thomas, as one of the disciples of Christ, was associated with a certain strain of particularly Gnostic Christianity. Some of you are going to be familiar with the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas being a remarkable collection of sayings that draw from both, or resemble both sayings in the canonical Gospels, but also include many that have a far more mysterious, esoteric, and even kind of Zen dimension to them. This is another Thomas-related text, the Acts of Thomas, and at one point the saint is in prison, and he sings this song. And the song itself is probably, almost certainly, earlier than the composition of the Acts of Thomas, and most likely was not Christian, because as you can see, it doesn't really, as you will see, it doesn't really have a particular Christian character. Boiled down, there's the prince in a kingdom. In the beginning, he's wearing his fine robes in his kingdom, and his parents give him a charge, which is to go into Egypt, or the sort of the world of the demons, and to retrieve a pearl from a serpent who's in the bottom of a lake. So he goes on his journey, but in order to move into this world, he must disguise himself. So he puts on their clothes. And he's hanging out in a bar, and he actually sees one person who's like him from his land, and they have a brief conversation. But nonetheless, he's tempted by the food, or it's not even temptation. He just eats some of the food, and as in a story out of fairy lore, in eating the food, he forgets who he is. He enters into this world. And so he's living in that world. And then back home, his parents go, well, what happened? What's going on? Where's the kid? Where's the pearl? So they send him a letter, a text. They send him a text. And the text takes the form of an eagle and finds him in Egypt and speaks the words of the letter. And the phrases and the words that were in the letter were the words that were written in my soul. And I remembered who I was, and I remembered what my purpose here is. And so he reawakens in this act of anamnesis, an important term for Phildick, or recovery of memory. And in that act then goes and sort of takes the pearl from the serpent, and guided by the letter returns to his kingdom and puts on these robes that are beautifully described as glittering with the movements of gnosis, of mystical knowledge. So it's an extraordinary piece of literature. It's worth reading because it's very short, and unlike most Gnostic literature, it's not gobbed up with like bizarre, hierarchies of incomprehensible archons, and it can get very kind of paranoid conspiracy theory in there in the ancient Gnostic archive. But this is a very beautiful kind of poetic text, and it's one that he refers to very pointedly in early accounts of his 2374 experience, of the experience of the fish symbol. And he spoke quite frequently about this experience as an experience of anamnesis. So it wasn't just that he was being given a bunch of information, so much as that what was being triggered was information that he already had within him. A fundamental trope in Platonic psychology, the idea that we actually have come into this world already with our knowledge of the forms, already with our knowledge of the true world, and that learning is really a matter of remembering. But this question of memory is more mysterious, I think, with Phildick, because it has to do with some knotty topics that maybe we'll talk about in, in questions about the nature of time, and things get wiggy pretty fast. But the whole question of receiving information that one actually remembers is itself a gesture towards a kind of eternal return, where what seems to be the fresh event, the new event, is actually already inscribed in a return, in a kind of memory. And I think that's part of what's happening there, which again, we can all see in terms of the response to an event in the temporal lobes. It's not like we're outside of that level of explanation, but instead what we have is, I think, a much more accurate vision of what these kinds of experiences can be, which is that they're multi-level, like everything else in the world. They're multi-tiered, and there's no one place where the action lies. So we have this wonderful text and this gesture towards anamnesis. But the thing that I really want to pull out of this this story here is the fact that in the story, in the Hymn of the Pearl, what awakens the prince to his true identity is a text. It's not a god, it's not a burning bush, it's not a dove, it's a piece of writing. It's a piece of technology, really, or an artifact of technology. And for Dick, I think this was extremely important because it gave him, in a way, two great gifts for arguably the kind of, certainly to his own megalomaniacal tendencies to believe that he was kind of a prophetic figure, but also just as a writer. One of these was an encouragement to read voraciously, to seek in literature, to seek in history, to seek in encyclopedias, in philosophy, to seek for those shreds, those sparks, and those triggers that might reignite that event. And one of the patterns you see with the exegesis is this intense desire to have an encounter with information, to have an encounter with textuality, not just to read a book and go, oh, that was very interesting, it gave me a new perspective on dualism. No, to find that phrase or that concept or that model that would almost re-articulate the initial event, to once again be, aha, I've got it now. And you see this repeat itself over and over again in both marvelous ways and sometimes in very depressing ways. Because you can, it's like he's trying to grind, to wind up the system over and over again. There's one particular example of this that was most striking to me reading through it, which is that he reaches a point of terrible despair. It's one of the most bleak parts of the exegesis, where he's just, what am I doing? This is a disaster. I'm chasing shadows down a labyrinth. There's nothing here. I'm utterly bereft. And you can hear this voice. Throughout his fiction, he was clearly a depressive guy, but this is a real nadir. And then the writing changes, and he's like, amazed, I've discovered the truth. This is it, I've gotten it. And what he did is he opened up the text, importantly, he opened up the encyclopedia at random. It wasn't his intention. It was something coming from without. I opened it at random and came across Jacob Burma. Burma is my main man. And so he goes into this account of this marvelous, pietist, esoteric figure, one of the great figures in European Hermeticism and esotericism, whose Trinitarian system, very dynamic, threefold system, in many ways influences Hegel's dialectic and the whole notion of dialectical changes from one side to the other. I mean, it's an extremely important stream that Dick's style of thinking very much does resemble. So he was recognizing a true resonance across time. And even to the point that Jacob Burma's own experience, which is probably lore, probably just a fiction, but we don't really know. But as the lore has it, his first great enlightenment experience is he's a humble cobbler, he's a craftsperson, he's not a fancy pants prince, and he's working in his shop, and the light glimmering off a pewter dish sets him off. The light glittering off a metallic object is what transforms him. And this is very similar to Dick's own experience of this fish. And it's very similar to an experience that one of his characters has in a 1963 novel, about The Man in the High Castle, where the Japanese character Tagomi is sitting in the park. He pulls out a piece of jewelry, a metal object, and in looking at this metal object, he passes into another world, and from the parallel world of the novel into our world. And what interrupts this vision is a cop coming by, going, "Hey, what are you doing there, kid?" Oh, and the vision disappears. The cop is, I think, a very important part of that story. So suddenly, where are we? We're with Dick reading an account of someone having an experience that may be a fiction that resembles his real experience, which itself resonates with the story or an account that he already put into culture, into literature, 10 years before. Well, that's a very peculiar kind of resonation. And what's wonderful about the exegesis is that you can see this happen. Whether that refers to another order of reality or not, that's a very interesting question. But you don't even need to go there, or at least you can show that that enigma is already inscribed in the way in which these texts refer to each other, the way in which Dick sort of resonates across time. So you have this remarkable moment. I've discovered Burma, and then he's gloriously happy, and I love my exegesis. I love my life. He's like, it's working for him again. But there's one other twist to this tale, which he talks about this great discovery of Jacob Burma. But 60 pages earlier in the exegesis, he uses a phrase. And the phrase, the divine Urgrund, is straight out of Jacob Burma. You don't know, but it seems quite likely, and there's other things that indicate this, that he actually kind of already knew what he was doing. And one of the things that he does over and over again in the exegesis is that he pretends to know less than he does. He pretends to know less than he does. I don't know who Jacob Burma is. I've discovered Jacob Burma. But he actually already kind of knew who Jacob Burma is. In fact, it's quite likely that he already knew what a Christian fish symbol was, being a Christian, being interested in the counterculture, participating in the counterculture, and living in California in the late 60s and early 1970s. Now, that doesn't mean he's lying. What I think it means is that part of what he's doing is kind of setting up his own anamnesis, setting up his own shock of memory of, yes, that's the connection. And again, that's not even to say that this is undermining the luminous possibilities that's pointing to, but it's almost more as if his revelation, if you will, creates in the network of texts that surround it, the texts that he's reading, the fictions he writes, the fictions he wrote before the event, the non-fiction he writes in the exegesis and in some of his essays, that this whole thing becomes a kind of Phil Dickian labyrinth. It becomes one of his novels where you're not really sure who's creating it, where the author lies. Is the author playing a game with you? Is the author joking? Is the author mischievous? Is the author setting up a cruel joke? And so it's this remarkable kind of reflective mirror that nonetheless, I think, keeps pointing outwards to some of these really profound issues about time, about the nature of consciousness, and the structure of the world. So I'm trying to think. I mean, I can just keep going, as you could probably guess, and this is pretty interesting stuff. I think I'll probably which part should I wind up with? I think I'll end with the question of dissemination, of what you do with this stuff. Well, no, I'm going to do one part before that. One of the great questions about, the great religious questions to ask about Phil Dick is a simple one. Was he a Christian? Now, the kind of people who read Philip K. Dick don't really generally read Christian authors. And in fact, they're probably kind of a little squeamish about Christianity. Dick himself pretty regularly said, I'm a Christian, or more specifically, I'm an Episcopalian. And he became an Episcopalian, or sort of, you know, though he had a Quaker background, he sort of like threw himself back into the church right around the time of his first vision of this horrific, malefic face in the sky in 1963. So there's an important conjunction between his own visionary experiences and his relationship to Christianity. Some people want to say, yes, he's a Christian. Some people say, no, he's not a Christian, he's a Gnostic, or he's a Hermeticist, or he's whatever. And, you know, it's a kind of big question. I mean, I tend towards the Gnostic camp for reasons we can talk about if you're interested and want to ask me. But I do want to give one account of the Christianity in a way that I think makes it more interesting than just Jesus Christ died for our sins and the church has got us, da, 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 da. And that has to do with this question of the event, what an event is. And one way of thinking about, in a Christian perspective, so I'm speaking sort of from a Christian point of view, one way of thinking about what happens with Christ is an event, a rupture, a break. That it's not the old continuous world of return, of the return of the gods, of the return of the cyclicity of the seasons, of this immense, marvelous astrological cosmos of planetary deities that are determining the shape and flavor and form of human life. It breaks with that. It cuts with that. And the author of that vision, that perspective on the Christ event, is really Paul. And it's really Paul's notion that what Christ does is he breaks the law. That the law that has determined proper behavior within, within the life of the Jewish nation, but even larger within the grand determinism that many Stoic and other philosophers thought of as accounting for the cosmos, that instead he comes in with a great break and a great rupture. And for Dick, this was incredibly important because the way that he recoded Paul's distinction between the era of law and the era of love, and that what Christ does is break the determination of the law. For Dick, he recoded this as an escape from determinism, because one of the things that you can feel there's a kind of claustrophobia around him is that everything is set in motion, everything is controlled, there's no way out. There's a kind of endless, even a kind of repetition implied. Sometimes he really does gesture to this notion of a kind of eternal return. And the event, the rupture, is the way out. That there's kind of an escape implied in this. And this notion of a bit of information or a bit of noise in the line creating a rupture that breaks down a world is something that you see over and over again in his fiction. So there's this sort of recognition of a rupture as opening up the possibility for something transcendental that happens in his fiction, that happens in his worldview, and that is arguably happening in his brain. I mean, that's one way of even thinking about what do we do in our ordinary, constant reconstruction of the same old reality day after day after day. It's an immense repetition. Whether it's an eternal return or not is another question. But it's an immense repetition. And that extraordinary experiences, whether they're neurological or whether they're transcendental, interrupt that process, possibly create space for a radically new way of experiencing or constructing the world. So there's this sort of gesture towards a kind of escape, which Dick figures in very cybernetic terms. He's really thinking about how systems reproduce themselves and how noise enters in and creates the possibility of something new. But the other dimension of this kind of informational way of understanding change or the possibility of change within a determined system, within a system that's under control, within a system that's perhaps under control by nefarious archons or governments or corporations who are spreading their tendrils ever more finely into your psychic construction of reality as it seems to exist in your experience. That the way to break through that is through these cracks, through these ruptures, through these hidden clues. And this leads to the question of dissemination, and particularly having had this extraordinary experience, clearly thinking of himself to some degree. It's not quite a prophet, but something along those lines. Although there's never any indication that he ever wanted the exegesis read. There's no indication, except for like some goofy things where he almost makes fun of himself by giving it a title page and making up these kind of funny names for it. That basically this was his own private documents. That nonetheless, if you look at Valis, if you look at his final novels, there are a variety of ways in which he's sort of porting the wisdom of this text into these books that are going to go out into the world, that are going to be read by people, maybe even turned into a film. And as that happens, these sort of viruses of Valis, of these viruses of transcendental information, are going to be perpetuated through their reproduction and through their reception. And you can see this very clearly in Valis in any number of ways. There's some final texts appended to the end of the novel that are more or less exegetical material, although none of them come directly from the exegesis. And he writes The Divine Invasion, which plays with all sorts of very religious kinds of fables that again was very much inspired from the exegesis. And from a literary point of view, one of the most interesting parts of the exegesis is reading the dreams and ideas and visions that led to the Divine Invasion. And you can see the way in which he was drawing from his own experience, and particularly his experience of what he called the AI voice, which was a sort of linguistic presence that he sometimes associated with the goddess Sophia that would interrupt him on the edge of sleep. So it was like he was entering into a hypnagogic state, he's in a liminal consciousness, and he'd hear these voices, and or this voice, and then he would write it down, and that phrase would sometimes trigger whatever his next line of thinking was, or even to some degree his fictions. Again, the repetition of this sort of primal scene of an incoming trigger which sets in motion a whole meaning-making, cosmos-making kind of process. But it's the third novel that in a way is kind of the most interesting, The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, which is a wonderful, wonderful novel, just as a novel. Just if somebody who wasn't interested in weird stuff wanted a great novel. And what's really interesting about this book is that in many ways it's written outside of the whole exegetical experience, of the whole 2374 and all of the possibilities. It's the place where he can look at it as pathology, because there's a character in it who sort of seems to be going through a similar kind of obsession. There's references to secret early Christian texts. There's a kind of a clear sort of misuse, or how do you say this? A character who, because of his religious obsessions, is unable to respond empathetically and compassionately to the people around him. And so you can see Dick very tenderly and very amusingly and very cuttingly kind of taking on his own obsessive metaphysical self. And he's doing this, and this is remarkable, even as he continues to write the exegesis. Even as he continues to write the exegesis. So that's the place where you begin to see, we're in the place where the poison is the cure, where it's a deeply alchemical place, where the very obsession that pulls him out of relating to the world gives him the sensibility and the perception and the sensitivity to be able to give this really is on an emotional level one of his most mature and esoteric books. And it's also the book where he reflects most obviously on his own milieu of California and mysticism and the James Pike figure, who is really the book is really about. So it's sort of about the very context of his world that led to his 2374 experience. So it's this remarkable reflective move in the midst of this immense metaphysical, obsessive, claustrophobic, paranoid world building, where he's still able to step outside of it and without denying its power or its compulsive, obsessive character, to reflect and to contain and critique it in a very humanist way that ends up kind of affirming old, ordinary reality in a sad but also incredibly powerful way. So it's very interesting that that becomes his sort of last novel, even though I'm sure the next one he would have written would have been crazy, The Owl in Daylight, who knows, some, you know, metaphysical conspiracy theory, that, you know, he would have jumped back into the weird. But what we actually have is this very realistic novel that sort of puts all of this other stuff in perspective in a really powerful and really interesting way. So as I said, I could keep going on, but I'm not going to. I'm sure there's some really interesting questions. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. And yeah, let's have some more questions. Or you can clap if you want.
It kind of reminds me of people like Chico Xavier, the Brazilian guy who kind of wrote these kind of massive texts, supposedly channeled volumes. Did he have any kind of sense in which the exegesis is other voice coming through, or is it all completely autobiographical?
That's a very good question. Well, one thing is that even the word autobiography is not really correct, because a frustrating thing about the exegesis is he spends very little time going into detail about his experiences. It's almost as if he already knows what they are, so he's just going to speculate. It's a speculative text rather than an autobiographical one. So that's one point, although there are some remarkable dreams. And again, it's punctured throughout with these AI voices. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of these phrases extracted from Hypnagogia that he reads as being voices from outside. But really, other than that, there's not a direct sense of things being channeled at all. In fact, it's not there. On the other hand, it's clear that at a certain point, what the exegesis is not a content. It's not a particular claim about reality, but it's a process. On one level, it's just a writing process. On another level, it's clearly a healing process. But it's also a kind of weird informational cybernetic process. And he does begin to reflect on the exegesis as a kind of informational cybernetic object that is related, in some ways expresses the nature of Valis. So that Valis's own character as a kind of informational matrix of living information that's sort of rejuvenating the dead world, the dead determinist world with its life, becomes a kind of a model of his own textual practices. So there is a way in which the text is enchanted and it is driven by something more than him, but he doesn't phrase it as coming from without. But I'd like to hear more about the Brazilian call. I don't know about it.
It's a kind of a bit of a spiritist tradition of these people that apparently channel books, and he authored hundreds of novels in the style of dead authors.
Oh, okay.
But just kind of could not stop writing them.
Yeah.
In a kind of hypnagogic trance in a way.
Yeah. No, there's remarkable amount of textual productions out there. I mean, it's just you know, if it's the creative imagination is pretty creative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've come across the two times I read Valis, I was taking a lot of drugs. And I know from talking to lots of other people that they had similar experiences where it was almost like the novel had some sort of alien intelligence that was sort of pulling you in, that was sort of playing with. A lot of people, I've also heard people having really bad experiences who were taking a lot of drugs and it really started messing with their head, and they felt like there was something sort of malevolent or something that was pulling them into Dick's little. I don't know if you've come across.
Oh yeah, I mean,
that sort of stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, there's a whole, you know, talking about this question of dissemination. He really did, on some level, certainly on some subconscious level, want these texts and that text in particular to have within them these kinds of infectious, you know, vectors, you know, or a virus in a Burroughsian sense. And he was very aware of Burroughs, and in fact, of the authors, of the living authors that he mentions in the exegesis, Burroughs comes up more than almost anybody, I think. Maybe Joyce comes up, you know, about this much. So he's very aware of that. And it's certainly the case that I've encountered individuals like that. I've met people who were clearly were in the the kind of crazy zone, that they had gone into the sort of the world. And of course, if people are familiar with Robert Anton Wilson, his experiences that he relates in Cosmic Trigger are very similar in some ways, and they mutually recognize the similarity. Terence McKenna had similar kinds of experiences. So there's clearly some collective dimension to what he was happening that other people would go through, and even more so, there's something infectious about the worldview and the kind of craziness. So yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in that kind of reception. I can see the way in which that could be seen as a kind of malevolent thing, because there is there's a dark side to the game. He talks in a late essay, post 2374, about how he has a secret love of chaos, and what he likes to do. He's talking about the way that he's a world builder, the way that corporations or media industries are world builders, and that we're entering this phase of existence where there's all these manufactured worlds. And he says, look, I manufacture worlds as well, but actually I have a secret love of chaos. I like to destroy my worlds and to see what happens to my characters as their worlds are destroyed. And there is that level of gaming that goes on in the novels, and you can see that one part of him, if we want to break him down into different characters, is a labyrinth maker, a game player, and to some degree certainly a mischievous one, certainly a trickster with some of the dark side of the trickster. There's a remarkable part of the exegesis that was also in Lawrence Sutin's first culling of the book. It's probably the most sublime and beautiful part of it. Is a relatively short piece where he's describing a late theophany that happens in 1980. Theophany means encounter with, or a visionary encounter with the divine. And although it's less clear whether or not this theophany was separate from the act of writing this text, it's really kind of unclear at this point. But what he relates is this encounter with God. And what he does is he offers his speculations. And each time he suggests a possibility, God shows him how it reverberates into infinity. And so he's like, oh wait, well, so maybe it's this, blah, 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 blah. Try again. Maybe it's this, blah, 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 blah. Try again. And it goes on and on and on, and builds up this remarkable tension. And I'll just sort of let it hang there, because it's a fine piece to read. In terms of how it kind of resolves in an unresolved sort of way that's very Fildickian. But what's particularly interesting about this text, which in some sense is, the most important theophany that happens after 2374, and it's one in which his own process of exegetical speculation is brought to the forefront, where he's actually saying, look, this is what's happening. Every time I try to think about it, I reverberate through dialectics, and it spins off into infinity. I'm left with nothing. I'm going to do it again. What's the point? You get futility, you get immensity, you get infinity. It's a very peculiar event, but it's the character of God that's most interesting. His tonality as a character, like a character in a Fildic science fiction book. He's not just an abstract automaton. He has this tricksterish quality. He's not unlike Palmer Eldritch in certain ways, not so scary, but it's not dissimilar from that. So indeed, there is a kind of chain from Palmer Eldritch, who's the most creepy and disturbing of Dick's world builders, which still, in some sense, is a figure of his own authorship. And this figure of God, who's sort of setting up this immense labyrinth where every attempt you make to try to speculate your way out of it is going to reverberate into infinity and leave you, holding the check. So it's a real. I really like the question. I mean, I would love to, actually collect these kind of stories more. I know people who try to, collect some accounts of people's own individual experiences with Fildic, dreams and synchronicities and because there's a lot out there.
I think there's definitely a book out, or there is something peculiar. I mean, all Dick's fiction plays with your mind, and when you're smoking pot or if you're taking a lot of acid or something, it's brilliant. It really sort of lights up your brain. But when you get into Valis, it just sort of sucks you. It's Lovecraft, it just sucks you in. You know?
No, there's
you
a
lose control.
Yeah.
You do. It's like,
There's a
you gotta
Lovecraftian
pull
element.
yourself out, you know, sort of put your hand, I gotta get out of this.
Yeah.
What is it, the Empire Never Ended?
Yeah, yeah.
That just keeps on.
The Empire Never Died.
Don't do that. There's something about that loop
Yeah,
in the book
yeah.
that sort of.
And I think what's interesting about it is that it is very resonant with you know, the phenomenology of cannabis and psychedelics, but that you don't actually need to talk about that or experience that in order to show the way the texts themselves stage that phenomenon. That's really interesting. That you can, just by talking about the text, which we can all kind of agree are there, you can point to how these deeper, sort of more phenomenological, more personal explorations of consciousness function in a lot of ways.
I think you don't need to be stoned when you're reading it, that it actually will get you stoned.
Yeah.
Or it'll sort of trip you out.
Sure.
Yeah, there's something like that going on.
Yeah. My favorite, I had a number of weird dreams when I was first working on stuff when I was in my 20s, but the most interesting real world event was, it was my first lecture. My first public lecture was on Philip K. Dick's Postmodern Gnosis. This was like 1991 or something. And I was all ready, and then, you know, unlike now when I hardly ever take notes, I had all these notes written out, and I was ready to go. And, you know, and then I realized I was going to be talking about gnosis, but that I hadn't defined gnosis. I hadn't been able to come up with, like, what is a Gnostic worldview. I didn't get into that conversation here tonight either. But I was seeing, but that was a big part of my talk. So I was like, what are you? And then I had a copy of Valis with me, and I opened it to the first page right there, the first line I looked at. Gnosis is the world, and I was like, okay, here we go. So in a way, you know, I'm just bit by the serpent and trying to get myself, you know, but what else? What are you gonna do? Another. Yes,
Right, I was very interested in discussing Phil's, certain areas of Phil's personality and things. One of the things in my own research that I was quite intrigued about was the fact of Phil considering himself to be a star child and an abductee. And I know that Bill Sarrell mentions this, and he mentioned it in a recent interview. But I did a bit of research, and I found out that he did an interview with Brad Steiger. And in the interview, he actually claimed that he had been sort of abducted in some way when he was younger. And the reason I'm intrigued by this, I don't know if you know the story of the Eye, well you will, the Eye of the Sibyl. And in the Eye of the Sibyl, he describes how he was a young boy, he's a reborn person from ancient Rome as a young boy. And I'm just interested in how that fits in with your overall hypothesis regarding Phil and his religious viewpoints in terms of the idea that, you know,
particularly the alien, the kind of alien aspect.
Yeah, the concept of the plasmate.
Right,
things like that.
Right. No, I mean that's actually a good question. I'm not even sure yet how to wrap my head around the alien aspect of the plasmate. I tend to think about it more as a kind of allegory of information in the broadest, most cosmic sense of the term. Clearly there are deep resonances which he's not constructing between his way of talking about the alien and other, you know, aspects of this quasi-psychedelic space where, you know, abduction is possible, where Sirius plays an important role, where three-eyed, you know, spindly greys are, you know, doing their due. That, you know, he's moving into that world, and exactly how to account for that world, you know, I am frankly not sure about how to do that. I think there is another interesting point about the sort of abduction child thing, though, is that also the way that resonates with one of the claims about part of the psychological difficulty, which is that he was, you know, abused as a child. And there's, you know, some decent, you know, there's some decent evidence there. And again, it's a lot of through, you know, secondhand reports of things he had said to people at certain points, and he was a bullshitter, so it's kind of always hard to know what he was doing. Again, not as a way to reduce it, but just to point to this cultural complex that's much larger than this one man, that has to do with childhood experiences, with the vector of abuse, of some kind of pathological experience coming from the outside, and then the alien, whether the alien is the alien within of a disassociated response to a trauma, or the larger, alien of, cosmic entity or cosmic kind of being. So it doesn't surprise me that he would also, invoke that dimension. And I think that it also fits very neatly into a Gnostic worldview. It's not hard to kind of map ancient Gnosticism onto a science fictional world where we are not from this world, we're in a kind of prison planet, we're from a very, very far away star. Occasionally we get to, if we're lucky, we can escape and get back on the mothership. There are these beams of information that are trying to help us out, occasionally breaking through our, myopic reality. That these are all very science fictional terms, and in fact, you describe this Gnostic worldview to most people now, like, oh, it's like the Matrix, right? You're like, yeah, okay, it's like the Matrix, but it was also this way of seeing the world that emerged around the event of Christianity. In some ways, another form of Christianity, in some ways, a response or an attempt to elude some of the ways that Christianity was developing. But it really has to do with a similar kind of break in the cosmos. And even reading like Hans Jonas's book on Gnosticism, you can see that this question of the alien and the alien God and the way that alienation becomes a vector of actually alien identification. I'm not of this world, I'm of another world. That all of those things seem to open up that side of the equation. I mean, in a way it's almost kind of interesting he spends so little time, relatively, building up the kind of alien cosmology of the event. I mean, it's a vector, it comes up, he talks about his dreams, he talks about these three-eyed aliens who are, somehow involved in both the dark and the light side of the process. So it's definitely there. But in a way, that's what's interesting about him, is that his zeitgeist radar was so good that he was able to kind of reflect and either in his fictions or in his reflections or in his stories to his friends, kind of like give his own spin on all of these different dimensions, on Zen, on Taoism, on Vedanta, on free Christianity, on the UFO possibility, on,
I'm interested in this, in Revelation, during disease, during illness, and during confusion. Well, there's lots of characters to talk about who've seen interesting things when they've been sick or they've been confused. And I'm wondering if in Dick's work you get an impression that he's trying to exacerbate his own confusion. And also I'm wondering from a kind of Gnostic versus more normal Christian perspective, if you get any idea that of this reverence of the state of suffering or the state of confusion of Christ, but not the physical suffering, or also the why hast thou forsaken me suffering. So I'm just kind of interested in if he makes any reference to.
That's a very good question. I feel like there's some very specific examples that are not leaping into my brain right now. It's definitely the case that he strongly relates with the humbleness and the self-abnegation part of the Christian process. So the way in which the part of the whole vision of the divine, the symbols of the divine show up in the trash stratum. It's not just trash that's just like cultural detritus, it's also the lowest of the low. And he very much has that kind of, almost St. Francis-like vision of like going down to kind of go up. Whether he specifically links that to the moment on the cross, I believe less so. He seems to not really pay that much attention directly to Calvary and to the physical suffering. And in a way, that's part of what kind of gives it a more Gnostic character. And there's certainly Docetist ideas in there where it's just like a simulation. And so there's not so much of the physical suffering or the particular event of the death on the cross. But in other ways, his feeling for the lowly, his sense of empathy, his attempt to raise up the lowly but also keep humble about the actual conditions of ordinary human life. There really is a case to be made for this strong Christianity, I think, in a lot of ways. But then there's a lot of other kind of Gnostic dimensions. In terms of the first question, yes, the problem with saying, was he doing this to himself, is the great conundrum of intentionality. Like, who's doing what to whom? You know, when you're doing something to yourself, who's doing that? And it's tough to answer. And the other aspect of that this brings up that's related to revelation is conversion. If you go back to like William James's classic account of psychological account, consciously psychological account of conversion, what he talks about is the way that people essentially set themselves up for conversion, meaning that you begin to kind of read the world in a certain way. You set yourself up such that signs can come in, and suddenly, I saw the bumper sticker with the Christian Fish sign on it. Oh my God, just when I was thinking about that other thing. That process is in a way a intentional operation, but part of the way it works is for it not to be intentional. And I think, if you look at even ordinary neurosis and just the kind of crap we deal with all the time, we're always doing this to ourselves. We set ourselves up to repeat certain kinds of problems. We're not aware that we're doing it, and then in retrospect, we're like, oh yeah, actually, I totally set myself up to once again do that same dumb old thing that I've been doing all my life. And so I think we do that, and he does that in kind of a colossal scale, not just in terms of setting up a conversion, but also in terms of, I think, of kind of driving himself into this infinite loop in order to break out or to see what happens when the machine runs down, when it kind of bottoms out. So I think that would be fair to say that he kept himself in trauma to some degree in order to set up the light or the transcendence. But I guess that will be the note we'll end it on.
Brilliant. Eric, thank you very much. That was an amazing talk.